The Grand Imperial Hotel was a place of prestige, where only the wealthiest and most influential guests were welcomed with open arms. It was a towering structure of glass and steel, its marble floors polished to perfection, its chandeliers dripping with crystals that caught the golden light. Every morning, impeccably dressed staff bustled through the lobby, catering to high-profile visitors, who expected nothing less than absolute luxury. At the check-in counter, Amelia Reynolds stood with a small, worn-out suitcase in her trembling hands. She was barely 19, her dark curls slightly messy from the long bus ride, her clothes clean but modest, nothing like the designer outfits that surrounded her. Her wide, green eyes darted nervously as she clutched a confirmation email on her phone, scanning the elegant room filled with men in tailored suits and women in expensive heels. She shouldn't be here. She knew that. But it wasn't her decision. A few days ago, a representative from the Jason Statham Foundation had contacted her out of the blue. "You've been selected for our sponsorship program," the email had read. "A week-long stay at the Grand Imperial, all expenses covered, including meals and spa services." She had thought it was a scam at first. Why would Jason Statham, a global superstar, care about someone like her? But after verifying the details, she learned that the foundation often helped young adults who had aged out of foster care, giving them a chance to experience things they had never been able to afford. She had almost refused, but her social worker had convinced her. "You deserve to be treated with kindness, Amelia," Mrs. Carter had told her. "Just this once, let someone do something for you." So here she was, standing at the check-in desk, unsure if she had made a mistake. Behind the counter, hotel manager Baker Langley was observing her with thinly veiled disgust. Tall and sharp-featured, with an immaculately pressed navy suit, he exuded the kind of arrogance that came with power. He had built his career serving the rich and famous, ensuring that only the right people stayed at the Grand Imperial. And Amelia Reynolds, with her thrift store backpack and hesitant demeanor, was not the right kind of person. She cleared her throat. Excuse me. I have a reservation." Langley barely glanced at her before sighing. "Name? Amelia Reynolds." He typed sluggishly on the computer, his lips curling as soon as the reservation details appeared. His eyes flicked from the screen to her face, then back again, as if confirming that this wasn't some kind of mistake. His expression darkened. "This can't be right," he muttered, his voice tripping with disdain. "Miss Reynolds, this is the Grand Imperial. Do you even know how much a night in this hotel costs?" Amelia hesitated. I know. I was told that everything was covered by the Jason Statham Foundation." Langley let out a short, cold laugh. "The Jason Statham Foundation?" he repeated, raising an eyebrow. "You expect me to believe that a Hollywood actor personally paid for your stay?" A few of the guests nearby turned to look, sensing the tension. Amelia felt her face heat up. She wasn't trying to cause a scene, but the way he was speaking to her made her stomach twist with embarrassment. "It's all in the confirmation email," she said quietly, holding up her phone. Langley didn't bother looking at it. Instead, he leaned forward, lowering his voice just enough to sound threatening. "Let's be honest here, Miss Reynolds. You're obviously in the wrong place. I don't know how you got this reservation, but this hotel is not for charity cases." The words hit her like a slap. She started, but the lump in her throat made it hard to speak. Before she could process what was happening, Langley turned to one of the front desk clerks and said, "Security." The young woman behind the counter hesitated, glancing nervously at Amelia. "Sir, maybe we should check." "Now!" Langley snapped. Amelia's heart pounded as two uniformed guards approached. The humiliation burned in her chest as she watched them advance, their expressions unreadable. She felt the stares of the guests around her, some curious, some amused, none willing to intervene. It was happening again. She had spent her whole life being shuffled between homes, told she didn't belong, that she wasn't wanted. And now here she was, standing in the middle of a grand hotel, about to be thrown out like she was nothing. And then, a deep, calm voice cut through the room. "I'd love to hear why you're kicking out a guest who has a fully paid reservation." The security guards froze. The front desk clerks exchanged wide-eyed glances. Even Victor Langley went rigid for a moment, before slowly turning toward the source of the voice. A man stood near the entrance, his posture relaxed but his presence undeniable. A man whose face was instantly recognizable. Jason Statham. For a moment, there was complete silence in the lobby. The tension that had been building, thick and suffocating, suddenly cracked under the weight of Jason Statham's presence. He stood near the entrance, his hands casually tucked into the pockets of his dark leather jacket, but his gaze was anything but casual. It was sharp, assessing, and locked directly onto Victor Langley. The security guards hesitated, exchanging uncertain glances. The front desk clerk shifted uncomfortably. Even some of the guests, who had been watching the unfolding scene with mild amusement, were now whispering among themselves, recognizing the man standing in the doorway. Victor Langley, however, was not so easily rattled. He was a man used to dealing with celebrities, VIPs, and people who thought their names carried weight. He straightened his shoulders, lifting his chin slightly, as he turned to face Statham fully. "Mr. Statham," he said smoothly, forcing a polite smile. "I had no idea you were staying with us." Jason didn't move. "I'm not." His voice was calm, steady. No need for theatrics. "But I'd still love to hear why you're throwing out a guest whose reservation I personally arranged." A ripple of murmurs ran through the onlookers. Amelia, still standing frozen near the desk, felt her pulse quicken. Her fingers curled tightly around the strap of her bag as she stared at the man who had just, quite literally, spoken up for her. Langley's expression barely flickered, but there was a slight twitch in his jaw. "I see," he said after a moment, his tone cooling. "Well, I'm sure you understand, Mr. Statham, that we have a certain standard to maintain here at the Grand Imperial. Miss Reynolds didn't exactly fit the profile of our usual guests." Jason's lips pressed together, the muscle in his jaw tightening just slightly. "Didn't fit the profile?" he repeated. His voice was still quiet, but there was an unmistakable edge to it now. "That's an interesting way of saying you humiliated someone without bothering to check the facts first." Langley's nostrils flared. "That's not what happened." "It's exactly what happened," one of the front desk clerks blurted out suddenly. All eyes snapped toward the young woman behind the counter. She looked like she immediately regretted speaking, but after a quick glance at Jason, she straightened her posture and continued. "Miss Reynolds showed her reservation confirmation, sir. You didn't even look at it before calling security." A flicker of irritation passed over Langley's face, but he forced a chuckle. "I was simply being cautious." Jason exhaled through his nose, shaking his head slightly. "No," he said, taking a step closer. "Cautious is checking a reservation before making accusations. Cautious is pulling a guest aside for a quiet discussion instead of humiliating them in the middle of a lobby. What you did wasn't caution, it was arrogance." Amelia's breath hitched. It was strange, hearing someone defend her so fiercely. No one had ever done that before. Not like this. Langley's composure cracked slightly, his fingers twitching at his sides. "Mr. Statham," he said, voice tight. "With all due respect, I don't think this concerns you." Jason's smile was slow, humorless. "See, that's where you're wrong." His gaze flickered toward Amelia, then back to Langley. "I make it my business when someone I personally sponsored gets treated like dirt by a man who should know better." Langley opened his mouth, but before he could respond, another voice cut in. "I agree." A tall woman in a crisp navy blue suit stepped forward from the crowd. She was elegant, in her mid-50s, with neatly pinned dark hair and a presence that immediately commanded respect. Langley stiffened. "Miss Harrington," he greeted, his voice suddenly more careful. Amelia blinked. She didn't know who this woman was, but judging by Langley's reaction, she was someone important. Miss Harrington turned toward Jason with an apologetic nod. "Mr. Statham, I'm Elizabeth Harrington, Director of Guest Relations. I sincerely apologize for this unfortunate situation." Then she turned to Langley, her expression hardening. "And I'd love to know why one of our guests was treated this way." Langley faltered, looking between her and Jason. "I was." "You were making a spectacle," she interrupted sharply. And you've just embarrassed this hotel in front of a room full of people. She gestured around them, and Langley paled slightly as he took in the many phones recording the encounter. Miss Harrington turned to Amelia next, her expression softening. Miss Reynolds, please accept my sincerest apologies on behalf of the Grand Imperial. Your stay is, of course, fully covered, and if there is anything we can do to make it more comfortable, please let me know personally. Amelia swallowed hard, her throat tight. I, I don't want to cause trouble, she mumbled. Jason chuckled lightly. You didn't. You just walked in. Miss Harrington nodded firmly. Exactly. The only person who caused trouble is standing right there. She turned back to Langley. Mr. Langley, you and I will be having a very long conversation. Langley's mouth pressed into a thin line, but he didn't argue. Jason turned to Amelia, then, his expression gentler than before. You all right? She hesitated, then nodded. Yeah, I think so. He studied her for a moment, then gave a small nod in return. Good. Then, looking back at the gathered crowd, he added, I think we're done here. And just like that, the moment was over. Amelia had never been the center of attention before. She wasn't used to people watching her, whispering about her, or standing up for her. But now, as she stood frozen near the front desk of the Grand Imperial, she could feel every eye in the room locked onto her. Jason Statham's presence had changed everything. The hostility that had surrounded her moments ago, the sneering tone of Victor Langley, the way security had approached her as if she were some kind of intruder, had been replaced with uncertainty. The atmosphere in the lobby was tense, charged with unspoken questions. Victor Langley had gone pale. His composure, once unwavering, now showed cracks. He had made a mistake, a big one. He had acted without thinking, without verifying, and now, standing before one of the most recognizable actors in the world, he was scrambling to find a way to fix it. I assure you, Mr. Statham, this is all a misunderstanding, Langley said, his voice carefully measured. Had I known that Miss Reynolds was your guest, none of this would have happened. Jason didn't so much as blink. That's the problem, isn't it? His voice was quiet, but it carried weight. It shouldn't matter if she was my guest or not. You treated her like garbage before you had the facts. Langley opened his mouth, but no words came. He turned slightly, as if looking for support, but found none. The receptionist stood stiffly behind the desk, silent, unwilling to defend him. The security guard shifted awkwardly, realizing they had nearly dragged a paying guest out onto the street. The other hotel guests whispered among themselves, some recording the scene on their phones. Jason exhaled through his nose, then turned to Amelia. Did you get a chance to check in? She hesitated. No. He nodded once, then looked at the nearest receptionist. Make sure her room is ready immediately. The young woman behind the desk jumped into action, her fingers flying across the keyboard. Right away, sir. Langley took a step forward. Mr. Statham, Jason turned his head slightly, his expression unreadable. What? Langley swallowed. His usual arrogance was gone, but he was still grasping at whatever dignity he had left. I sincerely apologize for the way this was handled. I take full responsibility for the oversight. Jason let the words hang in the air for a long moment, then finally said, Good. Langley's shoulders relaxed slightly, thinking that was the end of it. But then Jason spoke again. But an apology doesn't undo what happened. A flicker of annoyance flashed in Langley's eyes. You've humiliated her. Jason's voice was still level, but there was a coldness beneath it now. You made assumptions. You decided, without any proof, that she didn't belong here. And the only reason you care now is because I showed up. Langley's jaw tightened. I admit, I could have handled it differently. Differently? Jason scoffed softly. You had security drag her out. Langley's mouth opened, then closed. Jason tilted his head slightly. Tell me something. If I hadn't walked in, what would have happened to her? Langley didn't answer. The truth was, everyone in the room already knew the answer. Jason nodded to himself, then turned his attention to Elizabeth Harrington, the director of guest relations, who had been silently observing. What happened next? Elizabeth didn't hesitate. "Mr. Langley, I'll need you to come with me to my office," she said coolly. "We have a lot to discuss." Langley hesitated, then nodded stiffly. Without another word, he turned on his heel and strode toward the staff hallway, disappearing from view. Elizabeth turned back to Amelia. "Miss Reynolds, I want to personally assure you that this is not how we treat our guests. Please allow me to make up for this experience. If there's anything you need, anything at all, don't hesitate to reach out." Amelia shifted uncomfortably. "I don't want to be a problem." "You're not." Elizabeth's tone softened. "The problem has been dealt with." Jason glanced at Amelia. "You good?" She met his gaze and, for the first time since stepping foot in a hotel, felt like she actually belonged. She nodded. "Yeah," she said. "I think so." Victor Langley sat stiffly in the dimly lit office, his fingers tapping against the armrest of the leather chair. The walls around him, lined with framed awards and photos of high-profile guests who had stayed at the Grand Imperial, suddenly felt like they were closing in. Across the desk, Elizabeth Harrington, the director of guest relations, flipped through a folder with deliberate slowness, her expression unreadable. Outside, the hotel buzzed as if nothing had happened. Guests checked in, concierges arranged last-minute dinner reservations, and staff moved with their usual efficiency. But inside this office, the air was thick with something far heavier than the scent of expensive wood polish. Elizabeth finally looked up, setting the folder down with a quiet thud. "Let's start with the basics," she said, her tone cool and professional. "Do you have any explanation for your actions?" Langley adjusted his tie, trying to regain some of his usual confidence. "I was enforcing our hotel standards. We cater to a particular clientele, and it's my responsibility to ensure that the reputation of the Grand Imperial remains intact." Elizabeth raised an eyebrow. "So maintaining our reputation requires humiliating a guest in the middle of the lobby?" Langley tensed. "I didn't." "You did." Elizabeth's voice remained calm, but there was a sharpness beneath it. "You disregarded her reservation. You didn't check any records before calling security. And you belittled her in front of other guests." Langley exhaled through his nose, his jaw tightening. "I was mistaken." "No," Elizabeth corrected. "You were reckless. And your mistake didn't just affect one person. It embarrassed the hotel. We have press inquiries coming in already, social media coverage that is growing by the minute, and..." She opened the folder again, pulling out a printed page. "We're officially trending on Twitter under the hashtag Justice for Amelia." Langley's fingers curled slightly against the desk. "This is being blown out of proportion." Elizabeth studied him for a long moment. "You still don't get it, do you?" She leaned forward slightly, her hands folding together. "This hotel is not just about marble floors and high-end service. It's about reputation. And while a scandal like this won't shut us down, it will leave a mark. One that people will remember." Langley shifted in his chair, his posture growing rigid. "I take full responsibility," he said finally. "I'll issue a public apology. Damage control." "There is no damage control." Elizabeth cut him off smoothly. "There's only accountability." A knock on the door interrupted them. One of the assistants stepped inside, her eyes flickering toward Langley before settling on Elizabeth. "Mr. Statham is here," she announced. Langley's stomach twisted. Elizabeth nodded. "Send him in." The assistant stepped aside, and Jason Statham entered the office. He moved with the same calm authority he had displayed in the lobby, his presence filling the room effortlessly. He didn't bother sitting. Instead, he leaned slightly against the desk, arms crossed over his chest, his gaze locked on Langley. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Jason exhaled, shaking his head. "I've seen a lot of arrogance in my life," he said. "But you take the cake." Langley forced himself to keep his expression neutral. "I've already apologized." Jason smirked. "Oh, so that makes everything fine, does it?" His voice was quiet, but every word cut deep. "Let's talk about what would have happened if I hadn't shown up. Amelia would have been thrown out onto the street. A young woman, alone in an unfamiliar city, treated like trash because you decided she didn't belong here. Langley didn't respond. Jason took a slow step forward. Tell me something. How many other guests have you treated this way? How many others didn't have someone to step in for them? Langley's face twitched, but he said nothing. Elizabeth cleared her throat. Mr. Langley, your time at the Grand Imperial is over. The words landed with finality. Langley's stomach dropped. There's nothing else to say, she interrupted. You'll be escorted out today. Your resignation will be framed as a mutual agreement to avoid further damage to your reputation. She tilted her head slightly. It's the best offer you're going to get. Langley's hands curled into fists, but he knew there was no point in fighting. He wasn't in control anymore. He rose stiffly from his chair, glancing briefly at Jason, who still hadn't moved. This is ridiculous. No, Jason said. What's ridiculous is thinking you can treat people like dirt and get away with it. Langley turned and walked toward the door, his footsteps heavy. As he left the office, the weight of what had just happened finally hit him. Jason watched him go before exhaling, shaking his head. Well, he muttered. That's handled. Elizabeth sighed. For now. Jason glanced at her. What happens next? Elizabeth straightened her posture. We make sure Amelia is taken care of. Jason nodded. Good. Then, almost as an afterthought, he added, and make sure the next manager knows what real hospitality means. By the time Amelia stepped out of her hotel room the next morning, the world outside had already shifted. She had barely slept, her mind racing with everything that had happened in the past 24 hours. One moment, she had been humiliated at the front desk, made to feel like she didn't belong, and the next, Jason Statham had appeared out of nowhere, standing up for her like some sort of guardian she never knew she had. Now, Victor Langley was gone, and she had been reassured, that she was welcome at the Grand Imperial. But it didn't feel real. Not yet. The hallway was eerily quiet as she walked toward the elevators, her sneakers barely making a sound against the thick carpet. When she reached the lobby, however, she immediately knew something was different. There were more people. Not just guests, but reporters. Cameras. A low hum of activity filled the grand space, and as soon as she stepped out of the elevator, she felt their eyes land on her. She stopped, her stomach tightening. A young woman with a press badge turned and whispered something to a colleague. A man with a camera lifted his lens slightly, not taking a picture, yet, but waiting, watching. Amelia swallowed hard. This wasn't just a bad night in a hotel anymore. This was a story. She turned quickly, intending to slip back upstairs before anyone could approach her, but she'd barely made it 2 steps before she heard her name. Amelia. She froze. Jason Statham was standing near one of the lounge areas, arms crossed, watching her. Unlike yesterday, when he had been direct and confrontational, his expression now was more measured, calmer. She hesitated. Hi. He took a step closer, lowering his voice slightly. I figured you'd see the crowd and bolt. Smart instinct. Her fingers curled into her sleeves. I didn't expect this. Jason exhaled, nodding toward the reporters. It spread fast. Once people saw the video, social media did the rest. The video? She echoed. Jason studied her for a moment, then pulled his phone from his pocket and tapped the screen a few times before turning it toward her. It was a clip from the previous night, the moment when he had stepped between her and Langley, his voice calm but firm. The subtitles beneath read, Jason Statham stands up for orphan after hotel tries to kick her out. The video had millions of views. Amelia's throat felt tight. Oh! Jason pocketed his phone again. I know it's a lot, he said, his voice steady. But it's not all bad. People are on your side. They're talking about it, calling out how wrong that was. She didn't know what to say. Jason must have noticed her hesitation, because he sighed and tilted his head toward the cafe in the corner of the lobby. Come on. Let's grab some coffee and talk. Amelia hesitated. I don't want more attention. He smirked. Then it's a good thing I know a way to get around that. Before she could ask what he meant, Jason casually shrugged off his leather jacket and handed it to her. Put that on. Hood up. Amelia blinked at him. What? Jason just gave her a look, one eyebrow raised. She hesitated, then slowly took the jacket, slipping it on. It was warm, slightly too big for her, and smelled faintly of cologne and leather. She pulled the hood up over her head, and Jason nodded approvingly. There, he said. Now you just look like some kid tagging along with me. No one will notice. She wasn't sure how that worked, but when Jason started walking toward the cafe, she followed. The moment they stepped inside, the noise from the lobby softened, replaced with the gentle clinking of cups and the low murmur of background jazz music. A barista at the counter did a double take when she saw Jason, but, to Amelia's relief, didn't react beyond a polite nod. They took a table near the back, away from the windows. Jason ordered a black coffee, while Amelia asked for tea, her hands still fidgeting under the table. Jason leaned back in his chair, studying her. I get the feeling you don't like attention, he said. Amelia swallowed. I don't. I never wanted this. Jason nodded. I know. But you also didn't ask to be treated like garbage. And people seeing what happened. It's a good thing. It means change. She exhaled slowly. I don't want to be a pity case. Jason's gaze sharpened. Is that what you think this is? Amelia hesitated, then looked down in her hands. Jason leaned forward slightly. Amelia, what happened last night wasn't just about you. It's about every person who's ever been treated like they don't belong. People are talking about it because they're sick of seeing that kind of crap go unchecked. She didn't answer. Jason studied her for another moment before sighing. Look, you don't owe anyone anything. If you want to stay out of the spotlight, that's your choice. But if you do want to say something, if you want to use this moment to stand up for other people like you, I'll make sure you're heard the right way. Amelia met his gaze. For the first time in a long time, she felt like someone was really offering her a choice. And for the first time, she wasn't sure what to do with it. The storm had passed, but its impact remained. 2 days had passed since the incident at the Grand Imperial had gone viral, and while the lobby had returned to its polished elegance, a shift had taken place within its walls. Employees moved with a newfound awareness, exchanging glances that carried unspoken acknowledgments. The air was lighter, yet charged with the weight of change. Amelia sat at a corner table in the hotel's rooftop lounge, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea. The sun was beginning to set, casting warm amber hues over the skyline. The city stretched beneath her, vast and indifferent, yet tonight, she didn't feel as invisible as she once had. Jason Statham sat across from her, leaning back in his chair with the ease of someone who had seen and done it all. He stirred his coffee absent-mindedly, his gaze flicking toward her every so often. You've been quiet, he finally said. Amelia shrugged. I'm not used to people wanting to hear what I have to say. Jason studied her for a moment before exhaling. That's gonna have to change. She let out a quiet laugh. Yeah? And what if I don't want it to? Jason smirked. Then I guess you go back to keeping your head down. Pretending things like this don't happen. Pretending it didn't happen to you. He set his coffee down. Or, you could take this moment and make it mean something. She frowned slightly. How? He gestured toward the phone sitting between them. You've seen the response. People aren't just mad about what happened to you. They're mad because they've been in your shoes. Because they've seen it happen before and couldn't do anything about it. But right now, they're listening. Amelia hesitated. I'm just me. Jason leaned forward. And I'm just a guy who fights in movies. But here we are. She bit her lip, thinking. Jason let the silence settle before leaning back again. I get it, he said finally. You didn't ask for this. And I'm not saying you need to stand on a stage and start making speeches. But if you want to, I can make sure your voice reaches the right people. You have a chance to turn this into more than just a viral moment. It could be a step toward real change. Amelia looked out over the city, the weight of his words settling in. For so long, she had felt powerless. She had spent years being shuffled between homes, learning how to blend in, how to not take up space. And now, for the first time, someone was telling her she could take up space. That she should. She turned back to Jason. Okay. A flicker of approval crossed his face. Yeah? She nodded. Yeah. I don't know what I'm doing, but I don't want to waste this. Jason smirked. Good. We'll figure it out. A comfortable silence stretched between them before Jason sat up, stretching. All right, first things first, you actually gonna enjoy this hotel now? Amelia laughed. I think I can do that. Good, he said, because I just found out they've got a dessert buffet, and I don't intend to miss it. For the first time in a long time, Amelia let herself relax. And for the first time ever, she let herself be seen.